My retirement clock had been silent for almost 7 years. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, it suddenly chimed again. Exactly 3 minutes after my elderly neighbor backed his old pickup out of the driveway. The next afternoon, it remained silent until he left again. By Friday, I stopped believing the clock was broken. If it wasn't keeping time, what exactly was it waiting for? If you've ever noticed an ordinary routine that refused to be ordinary, stay with me for a little while. For several minutes I stood in my living room, staring at the antique wall clock. The brass pendulum moved smoothly. The gears sounded healthy. Nothing about its movement explained why it ignored every hour except one. When I retired from the Navy after 31 years supervising communications maintenance, the old shipyard presented me with the clock as a farewell gift. "It doesn't always tell time," the foreman joked, "but it always tells you something." I laughed then. Now I wasn't laughing. During 3 decades managing communications systems, I learned something that prevented more operational failures than replacing faulty equipment. When one signal appeared only under one specific condition, the condition usually mattered more than the signal. The following afternoon, Walter Hayes walked across my yard carrying 2 tomatoes from his garden. "They're finally ripening. They look better than mine." We talked about weather, his aching knees, the Founders' Day parade coming later that month. Neither of us mentioned the clock. Exactly 4 minutes after Walter climbed into his truck and drove away, the old clock chimed once. Not twice, not the correct hour. One deliberate chime. That evening, I carefully removed the clock's wooden back panel for the first time. I expected worn gears, perhaps an old repair tag. Instead, I discovered several tiny, handwritten dates tucked beneath the inside molding. Every date had been written in fading pencil. Every one fell on a Tuesday or Friday afternoon. Every one matched days I remembered Walter leaving home for veterans' medical appointments. Coincidence felt less convincing with every line I read. The final notation stopped me completely. "Do not adjust afternoon sequence." Sequence, not timing, not mechanism, another carefully chosen word. The following morning I visited the small storage room where I kept old shipyard memorabilia. Inside one weathered cardboard box rested maintenance manuals, retirement photographs, repair notebooks, and faded employee newsletters. Near the bottom, I found the original maintenance card that had accompanied the clock. Most entries recorded routine cleaning, oil changes, pendulum adjustments. One handwritten instruction appeared in different ink from the rest. Service only, according to community schedule. Community, not mechanical. Another carefully chosen word. For the first time since the clock chimed again, I stopped wondering whether old springs and worn gears had somehow come back to life. Instead, I began wondering why an antique retirement clock seemed to recognize my neighbor's weekly departures better than any calendar hanging on my wall. I placed the shipyard maintenance card back inside its envelope without mentioning the hidden dates to Walter. Some questions deserved evidence before they deserved conversation. During 31 years supervising Navy communications maintenance, I learned another lesson that rarely failed. When one maintenance record contradicted another, the earlier service ledger usually explained why. The following afternoon, Walter wandered across the yard carrying a small paper sack. "Fresh peaches." My tree finally cooperated. We sat on the porch watching children ride bicycles down the street. He asked about my vegetable garden. I asked about his doctor's appointment. Neither of us mentioned the afternoon chime. Finally, I asked as casually as I could, "Still keeping busy on Tuesdays?" He smiled. "Old routines are hard to break." "Volunteer work?" "Something like that." Technically possible, emotionally incomplete. He looked toward the antique clock hanging inside my front room. For just a moment, his expression changed. Not fear, recognition. Then it disappeared. After Walter returned home, I unlocked the small filing cabinet where I kept every document the shipyard had given me upon retirement. Employee newsletters, maintenance reports, equipment retirement logs. Near the bottom rested one worn ledger labeled Clock Maintenance Records. Most entries documented ordinary repairs, cleaning, lubrication, pendulum adjustments. Then one page quietly stopped me. Every handwritten maintenance entry, matching the hidden dates inside the clock, had been signed by the same employee, Samuel Grayson. Samuel had supervised mechanical maintenance during my first years at the shipyard. He retired nearly 20 years before I did. Beside every signature appeared one identical notation: afternoon sequence verified, verified, not repaired, not calibrated, another carefully chosen word. The following morning I visited the old shipyard museum operated by the local historical society. Eleanor Brooks greeted me before I reached the archive desk. "I wondered when the clock would bring you here." "The clock?" She smiled gently. "It always does." "Not if. When." Without another word, she unlocked a narrow archive room behind the museum office. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, shipyard maintenance ledgers, volunteer rosters, retirement records, community newsletters. She carefully removed one slim binder labeled Neighborhood Assistance Schedule. Not maintenance, not history. Assistance. The word quietly settled into my thoughts. Inside rested weekly volunteer calendars dating back more than 30 years. Every Tuesday and Friday afternoon carried the same handwritten notation: signal confirmed, signal, not reminder, not appointment, another carefully chosen word. Driving home, I realized my first conclusion had quietly collapsed. The afternoon chime had never existed simply to announce Walter's departure. It had always been confirming something much larger than one man's weekly routine. For the first time since the old retirement clock came back to life, I stopped asking how the mechanism knew Walter had left home. Instead, I began wondering who had been quietly listening for that single afternoon chime all these years. For the next several days, I behaved exactly the way Walter expected. I stopped asking about the afternoon chime. I thanked him for the peaches. I even joked that old clocks sometimes developed stranger habits than old sailors. He smiled with visible relief, not because the mystery had disappeared, because he believed I had stopped following it. During 31 years supervising Navy communications maintenance, I learned another lesson that quietly solved more failures than replacing radios ever could. The moment people believed you had stopped tracing a signal, they stopped protecting the network behind it. That became my strategy. On Wednesday morning, I returned to the Historical Society. Eleanor Brooks was already waiting beside the archive room. "I had a feeling you'd come back." "I still have questions." "I know." Without another word, she unlocked a second storage cabinet I had never noticed before. Unlike the public archives, these shelves contained no shipyard blueprints or town maps. Instead, they held volunteer notebooks, handwritten schedules, donation ledgers, and neighborhood correspondence dating back more than 40 years. Eleanor carefully removed one narrow binder. Across the cover appeared 4 simple words: Quiet Harbor Volunteers. Not veterans, not charity, volunteers. The wording quietly settled into my thoughts. Inside rested weekly records written in careful blue ink. Every Tuesday and Friday afternoon carried the same handwritten notation. Clock acknowledged. Acknowledged. Not activated. Not repaired. Another carefully chosen word. I looked toward Eleanor. What exactly was the clock acknowledging? She hesitated. The records answer that. Technically honest, emotionally unfinished. Instead of pressing her further, I quietly turned another page. Folded inside rested an old black and white photograph. Walter stood beside several retired shipyard workers, loading grocery bags into the trunks of different cars. No uniforms, no ceremony, no publicity. The back of the photograph carried one handwritten sentence. Help arrives after the signal. For the first time since the clock chimed again, my first conclusion quietly collapsed. The afternoon signal had never existed, simply to announce Walter's departure. Driving home, another realization settled into my thoughts. If volunteers gathered only after the clock chimed, then whatever mattered most had always begun after Walter left home. That afternoon, I opened one final box of retirement papers I had ignored for years. Between old newsletters rested a small leather notebook, not my work journal, not maintenance records, a volunteer coordinator's log. Across the inside cover, someone had written only 6 words. Open after the clock returns. Not after retirement, not after Founder's Day, after the clock returns. For several long moments, I simply held the notebook without opening it. Then another folded document slipped onto the table. A volunteer access card issued by the town Veterans Outreach Office. Its date matched every afternoon signal recorded inside Eleanor's binder. The antique retirement clock was no longer leading me toward an unusual mechanical mystery. It was quietly leading me toward a neighborhood promise that had apparently depended on perfect timing for decades. One that no one intended to explain until the clock finally found its way back home. I carried the volunteer coordinator's notebook home without opening it. Some promises deserved the same patience as the people who had quietly protected them. For years, I believed the antique clock represented nothing more than 30 years of honest work at the shipyard. Now, I wasn't certain it had ever existed simply to tell time. During 31 years supervising Navy communications maintenance, I learned another lesson that quietly prevented more failures than replacing broken transmitters. The most valuable signal was rarely the one everyone noticed. It was the one only the right people understood. That evening, I spread every clue across my dining room table. The hidden maintenance dates, the shipyard repair ledger, Samuel Grayson's service records, the volunteer schedules. The unopened coordinator's notebook rested quietly in the center. Every document repeated the same idea: signal, not time. The following morning, I finally opened the notebook. Inside rested only one handwritten page. No volunteer roster, no meeting minutes, only one sentence written in careful blue ink. If the clock ever returns, don't ask who heard the chime. Ask who quietly answered it. I read the sentence twice, then a third time. The mystery quietly changed. The afternoon chime had never existed to summon people. It existed to reassure them. Later that morning, Eleanor Brooks invited me back to the Historical Society. She wasn't waiting inside the archive room. She stood inside the town museum's unfinished Founders' Day exhibit. Display cases surrounded us. Old shipyard photographs, Navy memorabilia, founding documents. Construction workers quietly adjusted the final exhibit panels before opening day. "I think you're finally ready." She carefully unfolded one large display layout. Across its center stretched a map of our neighborhood. Colored pins connected Walter's house, the old shipyard, the Veterans Outreach Office, the Church Fellowship Hall, and 6 other homes. Every route ended beside one small drawing, the antique clock. "It was never just a retirement gift," Eleanor said softly. "It became the neighborhood's quiet signal. Technically complete, emotionally unfinished." She pointed toward one faded notation written decades earlier by Samuel Grayson. "Community Coordination Station, not decoration, not keepsake." Another carefully chosen phrase. Eleanor quietly explained that after several aging veterans began living alone, local volunteers developed a simple system to help without embarrassing anyone. Walter always left home at nearly the same time for appointments or errands. When neighbors heard the afternoon chime, they knew his house was empty long enough for volunteers to quietly mow his lawn, repair broken steps, stock groceries, leave heating assistance, or complete small home repairs before he returned. No one accepted charity. Everyone simply found unexpected help waiting at home. Driving back through town, every earlier conclusion quietly collapsed. The clock had never been announcing Walter's absence. It had quietly protected his dignity. That afternoon, I attended a planning meeting for the upcoming Founders' Day celebration. Charles Benton reviewed the final historical exhibits. One recommendation immediately caught my attention. Undocumented community traditions excluded from permanent exhibition. The quiet network Samuel created would disappear beneath one perfectly reasonable administrative decision. I asked no questions. Charles noticed me and smiled. "I'm glad you're here. I wanted to understand. I think you'll appreciate our simplified history." He believed I had accepted the clock as little more than an interesting antique. Strategic surrender quietly lowered every remaining defense around him. As volunteers packed away exhibit materials, one large archive folder slipped onto the floor. Several pages scattered across the room. Most contained museum layouts. One page carried a heading I had never seen before: Veterans Outreach Heritage Review. Across the bottom, 3 words had been stamped in blue ink: supporting authorization required. Required. Not recommended. Not optional. For the first time since the clock chimed again, I understood the real deadline. Founders' Day wasn't simply celebrating our town's history. It would determine whether decades of quiet service to forgotten veterans became part of that history, or quietly disappeared behind one perfectly reasonable exhibit decision. 5 days remained before the Founders' Day celebration. 5 days before decades of quiet service to forgotten veterans would either become part of our town's permanent history or quietly disappear beneath one ordinary administrative decision. I spread every document across my dining room table: the hidden maintenance dates, the shipyard repair ledger, Samuel Grayson's service records, the volunteer schedules, the Veterans Outreach Heritage Review. Every page quietly pointed toward the same conclusion. One supporting authorization still remained missing. During 31 years supervising Navy communications maintenance, I learned another lesson that prevented more failed inspections than replacing faulty equipment ever could. When every document pointed toward one missing authorization, that authorization usually carried the only signature everyone still needed. The following morning, Eleanor Brooks arrived carrying a weathered wooden archive box. "I've been protecting this for years." "You promised Samuel." "I promised all of them." Inside rested decades of handwritten volunteer reports, neighborhood assistance records, maintenance schedules, letters from veterans who had quietly returned home to repaired porches, stocked pantries, cleared sidewalks, and mowed lawns without ever learning who had helped them. Then one sealed envelope immediately caught my attention. Across the front, Samuel Grayson had written, "Open only if the community signal is questioned. Not after my death. Not after retirement. After the signal itself is challenged." Eleanor quietly lowered her eyes. I hoped no one would ever need this. Inside rested only one small archive reference card. Not the missing authorization, just a catalog number. Historical File H14. Driving directly to the Historical Society archives, I located File H14 exactly where the catalog indicated. Its shelves contained neighborhood preservation records, shipyard volunteer files, veterans outreach reports, and Founders Day planning documents stretching back nearly 40 years. The divider marked H14 stood completely empty. The file had been removed, not recently, years earlier. For the first time since the clock chimed again, disappointment settled more heavily than curiosity. Without the supporting authorization, Samuel's quiet network appeared incomplete. That afternoon, I attended another Founders Day planning meeting. Charles Benton greeted me warmly. "I'm glad you came." I wanted to understand. "So do all of us." He smiled toward the exhibit drawing spread across the conference table. "We're preserving only what history can properly verify." Technically honest, emotionally incomplete. Near the end of the meeting, one volunteer accidentally dropped a large portfolio onto the floor. Historic photographs scattered across the room. I bent to help gather them. One image immediately caught my attention. It showed Samuel Grayson standing beside the antique clock while several retired shipyard workers quietly loaded groceries into different cars. The date beneath the photograph stopped me. It had been taken nearly 3 years before the town officially recorded the beginning of the Veterans Outreach Program. The network everyone believed had begun through the Outreach Office had quietly started inside the old shipyard. Driving home, I realized the missing authorization file and the afternoon chime belonged to the same documentary chain. They had always belonged together. Just before sunset, Walter stopped by carrying a folded exhibit panel he had discovered while helping prepare Founders Day displays. "I thought Samuel would have wanted you to see this." The display wasn't finished, Across the bottom, Samuel had handwritten only 6 words. Final authorization attached before exhibition. Attached, not filed, not archived. Attached. The missing authorization had never been intended to remain inside historical file H14. It had traveled with the original Founders' Day presentation package. Somewhere before the celebration, that presentation package still had to exist, and unless I found it in time. The quiet compassion carried by one simple afternoon chime could disappear beneath one perfectly reasonable historical decision. I placed the unfinished Founders' Day presentation panel beside Samuel Grayson's volunteer notebook. For the first time since the antique clock began chiming again, I stopped thinking about the clock itself. The real mystery had never been the afternoon signal. It was the documentary chain connecting every veteran who had quietly received help without ever knowing who had provided it. During 31 years supervising Navy communications maintenance, I learned one lesson every experienced communications chief eventually accepted. One missing authorization rarely erased the truth. It simply delayed the moment when every remaining record finally confirmed it. The following morning, Eleanor Brooks called before the Historical Society opened. I found something. The missing authorization? No. Something even better. Within half an hour, I stood beside her inside the oldest archive room beneath the Shipyard Museum. Most visitors never knew the room existed. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling. Maintenance ledgers, volunteer correspondence, Founders' Day planning files, veterans outreach documentation spanning more than 40 years. Eleanor unlocked a narrow oak cabinet, tucked behind several retired navigation displays. Across the brass plaque appeared 4 simple words: Community Signal Archives. Inside rested carefully wrapped presentation packages from every neighborhood preservation project the Historical Society had ever protected. Each package contained maintenance schedules, volunteer rosters, outreach reports, planning correspondence, historical surveys, and supporting authorizations. Eleanor gently lifted one, tied with faded navy ribbon. Across the front, Samuel Grayson had written, Community Signal Network. My pulse quickened. It was here all along. It had to remain complete. She carefully placed the package on a long wooden table. Neither of us spoke while I untied the ribbon. Inside rested exactly what every earlier clue had quietly described. The original Community Signal presentation package. Not one document. An entire documentary chain. The shipyard maintenance records, volunteer schedules, neighborhood assistance logs, veterans outreach correspondence, historical preservation reports, Founders' Day planning files. Every record naturally confirmed the next. Nothing depended upon memory anymore. Nothing depended upon assumptions. Then I reached the page every earlier clue had quietly pointed toward. Final Community Signal Authorization. The authorization explained that Samuel Grayson and several retired shipyard workers had intentionally restored the antique clock to chime only during specific afternoon windows. The single chime quietly confirmed that Walter had safely left for regular appointments, allowing trusted volunteers to complete small repairs, deliver groceries, refill heating fuel, clear snow, or leave emergency supplies before he returned home. No veteran needed to request assistance. No neighbor suffered public embarrassment. The clock had never been keeping time. It had been protecting dignity. Track A quietly became Track B. The hidden maintenance dates, the repair ledgers, the volunteer schedules, the outreach correspondence, the historical surveys, the Founders' Day planning records. Every clue now formed one complete documentary chain. Nothing relied upon opinions anymore. Nothing relied upon incomplete memories. Then Eleanor quietly handed me one final sealed envelope. The historical committee asked me to wait until today. Across the front, Samuel had written only one sentence: "Open only after the documentary chain is complete again." I carefully unfolded the letter. "Joseph, if you are reading this, then the old clock has finally returned to the right wall. Never think its greatest job was measuring hours. It measured opportunities for neighbors to care for one another without taking away anyone's pride. If the clock ever stops chiming again, let it be because no veteran in this town needs to struggle alone. Quiet service lasts longer than perfect history. For several long moments, I couldn't continue reading. Eleanor quietly looked toward the museum window. "I never wanted you to think Walter had been hiding something from you." "I know. We simply couldn't explain everything until every record belonged together again. Technically complete, emotionally true." That afternoon, I attended the final Founders' Day planning meeting before the celebration. Charles Benton greeted me with the same confident smile. "I'm glad everything finally makes sense. So am I." He believed the missing authorization had disappeared decades earlier. He believed the community signal network would quietly vanish with it. I thanked everyone politely, returned every document to the presentation package, and left without revealing what I had found. For the first time since the afternoon chime returned, I willingly allowed everyone to believe the antique clock was simply another restored shipyard keepsake. Only Samuel had understood years before. Sometimes the strongest signal a community could send was one that quietly reminded neighbors to care for each other without ever asking for recognition. The Founders' Day exhibit hall filled long before the opening ceremony officially began. Retired shipyard workers quietly greeted old friends. Veterans shook hands with volunteers they never realized had helped them years before. Families wandered among restored tools, faded photographs, and handcrafted displays celebrating the town's history. Everything looked exactly the way a Founders' Day celebration should. Except for one thing. The future of the community signal network still depended upon one antique clock. Charles Benton stood confidently beside the main historical exhibit, reviewing the day's program. Shipyard history, harbor expansion, veterans memorials. Everything appeared professionally organized. Everything appeared historically accurate. Until he reached the final announcement. Only officially documented community programs will receive permanent recognition in the Founders' Heritage Gallery. The remaining informal traditions will be respectfully archived, technically reasonable, emotionally incomplete. The museum director looked across the crowded hall. "Before we begin, does anyone wish to speak?" I quietly stood, not dramatically, not hurriedly, just calmly enough that every conversation gradually faded away. "I do." Charles smiled politely. "I thought you might." He believed the missing authorization had disappeared decades earlier. He believed no complete documentary chain still existed. I carried the weathered community signal presentation package to the front display table, then removed only one document, the original community signal authorization. Samuel Grayson established this neighborhood signal under an officially recognized Veterans Outreach and Historical Preservation Agreement. Charles nodded respectfully. One authorization alone doesn't establish permanent historical significance. You're right, I smiled gently. That's why it isn't the only document. One by one, I placed every record across the table. The hidden maintenance dates, the shipyard repair ledgers, volunteer schedules, neighborhood assistance logs, Veterans Outreach correspondence, historical surveys, Founders' Day planning records. Every document naturally confirmed the next. No speeches, only evidence. Charles tried one final objection. The supporting authorization was never archived. No. I quietly opened the final presentation folder. It wasn't archived. It remained inside the original community signal presentation package, exactly where Samuel instructed it should remain. The final community signal authorization rested before everyone inside the exhibit hall. Every signature remained intact. Shipyard supervisors, Veterans Outreach directors, Historical Society trustees, town officials, and Samuel Grayson. The room became completely silent. Charles stared at the authorization for several long moments. "I've never seen this document," the museum director answered before I could. "It has always existed. It simply was never intended to be separated from the complete presentation package." Technically true, emotionally decisive, Charles slowly lowered his eyes. The confidence that had carried him through months of planning quietly disappeared. No dramatic confession followed. None was necessary. The documentary chain had already answered every important question. The town attorney carefully reviewed every page, then compared the authorization with the maintenance records, volunteer schedules, Veterans Outreach files, historical surveys, and planning documents. Finally, she closed the folder. The Community Signal Network qualifies for permanent historical preservation. The antique shipyard clock and its associated outreach tradition shall become an official part of the Founders' Heritage Gallery. Silence filled the hall. Then applause slowly spread throughout the room. Not for me, not for the paperwork, for every veteran who had quietly received help without ever losing his dignity. Walter slowly walked toward me, holding a small brass winding key. "I wanted to tell you years ago, I know, but Samuel made me promise." And he was right. He gently placed the old key into my hand, the same key that had quietly kept the antique clock ready for decades of faithful service. Across its worn brass tag, Samuel had engraved 6 simple words. "Quiet neighbors build the strongest communities." For the first time since the afternoon chime returned, I finally understood why the clock had never simply marked another hour. It had quietly reminded an entire town that the greatest acts of service are often the ones no one ever sees, only the lives they quietly protect. The morning after the Founders' Day celebration, I walked back into my living room before sunrise, not because I expected another mystery, because some signals deserved one quiet moment after they had finally been understood. Walter knocked softly on my front door. Neither of us said much. Words had already done their work the day before. Morning light drifted through the window and settled across the antique clock. For the first time in years, it remained silent. Walter smiled. I think Samuel would have liked that. I looked toward the brass winding key resting in my palm. You mean because everyone finally knows? He gently shook his head. No, because the town finally remembers. He reached beneath the old clock and carefully slid out a narrow wooden drawer I had never noticed. The drawer had never been locked. It had simply never needed to be opened before. Inside, there was no money, no medals, no official certificates, only one faded photograph, one handwritten letter, and dozens of folded thank you notes tied together with faded navy ribbon. The photograph showed Samuel Grayson standing beside the clock while several veterans quietly shared coffee around a small workshop table. No speeches, no ribbon cutting, no recognition, just neighbors spending time with neighbors. I untied the bundle of letters. One veteran wrote, I never knew who repaired my porch, but I knew someone still remembered me. Another simply wrote, the groceries always appeared before I admitted I needed them. Thank you for protecting my pride. Near the bottom rested one sealed envelope addressed to whoever someday inherited the clock. I unfolded Samuel's final letter. Joseph, if you're reading this, then the afternoon chime has finally completed its last assignment. I paused. The old brass pendulum reflected the first sunlight of the morning. Then I continued reading. Never remember this clock for the sound it made. Remember it for the silence it protected. Every veteran deserves the dignity of believing he still stands on his own feet, even when kind neighbors quietly steady him from behind. If one day the clock no longer needs to chime, it will mean the people have learned to become the signal for one another. That will always be the better ending. For several moments, neither Walter nor I spoke. He quietly placed the brass winding key beside the photograph. It belongs with the story now. Several weeks later, the antique clock became the centerpiece of the Founders Heritage Gallery. The afternoon chime was never restored as a public demonstration. Instead, visitors read the letters left behind by veterans whose lives had quietly been strengthened without fanfare. Every Tuesday and Friday afternoon, volunteers still check on older neighbors throughout our town. No clock tells them when to go anymore. They simply remember. If this story reminded you that the greatest acts of service are often the quiet ones, no one applauds. Thank you for sharing this journey. May your kindness become someone else's steady signal. May your compassion always protect another person's dignity. And may the legacy you leave behind continue guiding hearts long after the final chime has faded.